gentlemen. Perhaps I better declare my own tribal background. I'm a Scot, and I'm proud of it, but it's touched with drink spice from Serbia. His Highness Sheikh Salem touched very briefly on an issue which sears the soul of every household in Kuwait. I refer to the 605 Kuwaitis who were captured during the Iraqi occupation in 1990 and 91. Iraqi soldiers removed them from their homes, from their beds even, from the streets, from their cars, and violated the mosques by raiding even them. These citizens, men from teenagers to 70-year-olds who ranged from students to businessmen to civil servants, and were retired. 7 women were also snatched. All were taken to prisons in Iraq. One girl who was taken was only aged 14, and she had been hurled back across the border, having been totally deranged through torture and appalling abuse after 6 years of systematic ill treatment. To many, the numbers may not be that significant, but to a nation with a population of about 1.5 million, it hurts every single family. In proportionate terms, their numbers represent the equivalent of 250,000 American citizens, or 57,000 British people. Most of the missing were arrested during the months that immediately followed Iraq's invasion, as the Iraq Security Service sought to quell Kuwaiti resistance, and others were taken later as hostage during the run-up to Iraq's retreat. This is no simple list of missing persons lost in the confusion of war. 90% of the 605 names on the current records are documented by the International Committee of the Red Cross as people definitely held as prisoners. It could be that some of the missing are dead, but I believe that most are being held as a card for Iraq to play at a future date. After the war, Sheikh Salem set up the committee for the Kuwaiti missing and prisoners of war, and the sole objective is to seek their release and to find out exactly what did happen to these prisoners. And if they are dead, where are their remains? And in any case, these should be returned home under the Geneva Convention. The leadership Sheikh Salem has shown has been remarkable. No stone has been left unturned. No telephone call has failed to be made. No person has failed to be chased up. No world leader has been left in any doubt about the importance Kuwait attached to their families, be he President Clinton or President Yeltsin. Baroness Thatcher and President Bush have both moved heaven and earth at his behest to get some action, and indeed took part in a conference to highlight this very issue. But in truth, this is unfinished business. And the question is, where do we go from here? Do we give up? How can you possibly negotiate with a regime run by Saddam Hussein? A more powerful example of evil is hard to find. For those who have met and got to know the families left behind, this is just not an option. Children have grown up without their fathers. Wives in reality have become widows, some of them desperately young, on the brink of the rewards of married life when their husbands were taken. Remarriage is quite out of the question. Mothers are distraught. To abandon them, facing such a future, for all concerned, be they the prisoners or their families, without a vigorous fight, is just not acceptable. The world stage talks about human rights. These prisoners have rights, and they have the right to have every possible avenue pursued to seek their release. They are not criminals. Most of them are not even soldiers. They are civilians. The British government has declared, through the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Robin Hood, an ethical policy to run through all their dealings with overseas states. It has to be said that this was the policy of past governments, but today the policy has been given a fresh touch of paint. It would certainly be helpful to all of us to learn what fresh initiatives the government is taking in this regard. And I certainly look forward to Mr. Derek Fatchett's comments on this extremely important subject. But however, I already take comfort from the robust remarks made by Dr. John Reed this morning, who made it quite clear that as far as he is concerned, there should be no lifting of sanctions until this very important issue is resolved. The challenge is daunting. It is not one that frightens Sheikh Saleh, who keeps up the momentum of pressure despite his new responsibilities. But we should recognise the mountain that has to be climbed. For a start, the Iraqis deny they are holding prisoners, but the Baghdad regime has also denied detaining Iranian prisoners held since the Iran-Iraq war. And it has to be said that under the auspices of the ICRC, the Iraqis have met with the Kuwaiti representatives 51 times in Geneva. The results are frustrating. The Iraqi delegation does not have the power to take any action save to procrastinate. However, at least they have agreed to the existence of 126 files of Kuwaitis taken to Iraq. But apparently, these men have been, quote, lost in the desert. So frustrating has all this been that the ICRC now want to abandon their neutral stance, supervising and chairing meetings, and instead implement a new mechanism, giving themselves a more proactive role. This would also apply to the meeting of the Technical Committee, who meet bi-monthly on the board, and that too is bogged down. The ICRC have recommended that 45 cases with the best documentation and the most difficult to refute are put forward for discussion as a pilot project. And after 7 long years of cat and mouse games, why, you may wonder, does the committee persevere? What drives them? The answer is a profound belief, which I share, that there are Kuwaiti prisoners still alive and therefore worth fighting for. This is based on regular intelligence coming forward as a result of every release of a prisoner from an Iraqi jail, be he Pakistani, Egyptian, English even, or whatever. As soon as they get home, they are debriefed by a representative from the POW committee, often by its very capable and experienced director, Dr. Dayaj Alamzi. And it goes without saying, he has spent a lot of time over the years debriefing Iranian prisoners. They all, without exception, tell the same story. Kuwaiti prisoners are known to be in the jails. Word spreads. Sometimes they have been seen in an exercising yard, but contact is rarely made, for they're kept in separate quarters and moved on frequently. Hopes, however, have been raised recently by the release earlier this month of 318 Iranian prisoners of war who Saddam Hussein had long claimed he didn't hold. They didn't exist. Some, including the celebrated case of General Hossein Lashkari, have been incarcerated for 18 years. Nobody had any idea he was even alive. His experiences were horrific: torture, manacles, and in solitary confinement, and constant movement from one house or jail to another. Others tell a similar story, but the fact is they have survived and they existed. On their release, they told of being held alone in tiny cells, 1.5 meters square. Conversation was impossible, but they would leave messages for the next prisoner by scratching notes on the walls, giving names and information. Their condition on release was understandably very poor, barely able to stand, very stunted physically, and fearful at first of saying too much in case they were not returned to their families after all. For those who remain, we all fear that the Iraqis may have tested their chemical and biological weapons on them. In short, make guinea pigs of the prisoners. We will never know for sure because the Red Cross has consistently refused access to the prisoners. One thing is for sure, that Britain, one of the Gulf state's oldest allies, has a moral duty to strive through every fibre in our beings to put pressure on the Iraqis for the release of the prisoners. This has to be done through lobbying all our friends, No nation is too small or too great to take an interest. The United Nations has a role to play. We must ensure that sanctions are not lifted until we have full compliance with the relevant UN resolutions at the conclusion of the Gulf War. We are, however, faced with heavy and highly skillful emotional blackmail by Saddam Hussein, who has been distorting the issue by calling for sympathetic help with providing food and medicines for his own people. Only a week or so ago, the Labour MP George Galloway drew heavy publicity. Indeed, it could be interpreted as favourable propaganda for the Iraqis by flying out a little girl, Marianne, for treatment in a British hospital. Before we get carried away, we should bear in mind that all along, save for a very short period, Saddam Hussein had the power to exchange oil for food and medicines, but they do not arrive. A great proportion ends up in the pockets of his officials, whilst the rest piles up undistributed. The plight of the Iraqi people is due to their own leader, not to the international community. Matters are not helped by the tremendous pressures applied by nations such as France and Russia, who wish to start trading again with Iraq. It is important that the international community remain clear-eyed. Human rights must come before trade. Human rights are the right of every illegally held prisoner that he should be released and sent home to his family, or in the case of death, that the family should receive his remains. I trust that the conference will remain resolute in their support for a massively important cause which ultimately could affect any one of their own countries should they ever have the misfortune to suffer the same plight of Kuwait. And more than that, the future security of the Gulf, and indeed the successful conclusion of the outstanding matters with Iraq, are entirely consequent, in my view, on the release of the prisoners.